Okay, this is the audio review for Chapter 2, New Jim Crow, Lockdown. Okay, so in this chapter, she talks about how there's these myths about the criminal justice system, and that's typically what we hear more so than the reality, right? So she says that the TV cop shows that we often engage with, which of course myself, I am definitely not immune to that. I'm a SVU watcher, just like pretty much everyone else. Something like Law and Order, it's been on the air for 30 years for a reason. But anyway, so they show often a false reality of the legal system that most people then accept as truth. Because basically, what they're doing by the way they're creating these media narratives, they're perpetuating the myth that the primary function of the criminal justice system is to root out dangerous criminals and to punish them, right? So when it comes to these depictions in the show, they're very framed in a way that's very pro law enforcement, right? So for example, for Law and Order or something like that. Again, there are a lot of other crime and cop TV shows nowadays, and nowadays there's starting to be more shows looking at some of the problematic aspects of the criminal justice system and some of the more nefarious actors as well, like, kind of basically looking at cops that are crooked and things like this. But for the majority of representations in the media, it's basically promoting a system or a belief system that the cops are just trying to do the best thing that they can. And that, if they're throwing the book at someone, it's because they're ultimately guilty. Meaning, when you look at Law and Order, sometimes people get pulled in the beginning of the episode, but when the guy gets pulled in at the end of the episode, you know that that person's guilty, right? There's like a very clear sense. And while sometimes the court cases do, convict them, sometimes they don't. The idea is that the cops are just doing their best interest to try to lock up dangerous criminals, right? And one of the biggest myths I see in these portrayals that she'll talk about in the chapter really is just not true, is the idea that when someone asks for a lawyer, one magically appears, that cops stop interrogating them, that they respect that, right? When in reality is very different, right? In reality, many people never meet with a lawyer. Many witnesses themselves are paid or coerced, or oftentimes will recant what they said at the time, but that won't be taken as credible later on, right? And this is a problematic thing when it comes to just human nature in general, is that sometimes we do this bias selection where, let's say, you're a detective and you're trying to figure out who, basically committed a certain crime, right? Sometimes there's just the human biases that we have mean that sometimes you latch on to a particular person as a credible suspect, but then that can kind of blind investigators to other potential suspects, as we've seen in case after case that's been thrown out because of DNA evidence, where people have been on death row for 30 years and you find out they were innocent the whole time. They were claiming their innocence. And when you go and look back at the cases, you see witnesses were coerced and they recanted their stories and all of these kind of things that fall into place, right? And I mean, there's like 100 podcasts, right, based on these kind of exonerated people's stories. So the problem is that it's actually a feature of the system, not an outlier, right? We want the system to actually catch people and put away people that are dangerous criminals, right? But oftentimes that's not actually how the system is being used and how it's being maintained, right? So, for example, when it comes to the reality, sometimes people are stopped and searched and coerced or detained for no reason, right? Not because of probable cause, not because of anything pertaining to their particular direct guilt, but more so an assumption of their deviance based on social characteristics. So what that just means is that, your social class, if you're poor, you're suspected to be criminal. Your race or ethnicity. If you're a person of color, especially if you're a dark-skinned person of color, then you are suspect for being criminal. So these are the social notions that affect the way that we then determine who's a criminal and who's not, who's guilty and who's not, right? And really who we need to get justice for and who can just be, shot while jogging down a street and, investigators sit on that for months even though they have a video of a murder, right? Things like that. So when it comes to the reality, it's problematic, right? That sometimes sentences and penalties are so severe that innocent people end up taking plea deals just because they want to avoid, the possibility of getting a mandatory minimum sentence. So this is a problem, a flaw in the system itself. And it doesn't come down to just, oh, it's just racist judges or it's just, classist police systems. It's really the function of the system itself. And so we have to root out, why is it that the system is built with these biases? Why is it that, if one person commits a burglary, how we look at them matters, meaning what their race is, what their class is, what their gender is, what their level of education is, what part of the country they live in, their age. All of these things affect whether or not we consider them guilty, also alongside what are the facts of the case. So we have to be very careful, if you want to operate within the system and be part of the criminal justice system, is to not perpetuate that inequality yourself. But from, sociologists looking at the system from outside, we look at how it was historically constructed so we can try to understand how to dismantle it. So this is why this book is so essential, The New Jim Crow, because she really gets into how the system was built through court cases, through filings, through legal statutes over time, and how those things were influenced themselves by the political and social notions of the time, right? So it's problematic when we have a system that sentences 14-year-olds as adults, when we know that brain development doesn't finish until you're 25. And when we look at the disproportionate amount of young people of color who were roped into that, we can see that it's actually, again, affected by our biases. For example, there's a study maybe 5 years ago that came out that was looking at how we perceive age differently when it comes to race ethnicity. And so this kind of goes along the lines of prejudice. So there was this interesting study talking about the criminal justice system and juvenile delinquency, basically saying that if you are, Latino or African American male, then you're assumed to be about 2 to 3 years older than you actually are if you're a teenager, while a white male tends to be assumed to be about 2 to 3 years younger than he is. So let's go back to a 14-year-old getting sentenced as an adult. If you assume a 14-year-old is about 2 to 3 years older than they are, right, then you're assuming that's about a 17-year-old. And you assume a 17-year-old is much more culpable for the crimes they commit than a 14-year-old, right? But what if you look at that 14-year-old and you see an 11 or 12-year-old? Right? You think that they're younger than they are. Then you're going to kind of think that a 12-year-old has less culpability than a 14 or 15-year-old, right? So it's interesting how race and ethnicity even prejudices how we perceive age and culpability. So of course that's going to affect, juries, judges' decisions, things like that, plea bargains, everything. So again, we have to take all of these things into account, the macro and the micro, and understanding what the reality is, sorting out the fact from the fiction. So there's also this real impact of the focus of the war on drugs, which is, predominantly what she talks about, in making her argument about the racial caste system of today being mass incarceration, right? She says that the war on drugs itself accounts for 2/3 of the rise in the federal prison population and half of the rise in state prisoners from 1985 to 2000. So 500,000 people are in prison today versus 41,000 people in 1980. And so that's a huge increase, right? You ever hear someone say, oh, give 110%. And you're like, I can't do that. That's more than 100. The increase of federal prisoners, of the prison population from 1980 to 2000 is 1,100%. So 1,100% increase in the amount of people. So meaning, that's an extremely disproportional rise in the amount of, people being incarcerated. And drug arrests during that time have tripled, right? So since 1980, arrests for drugs have tripled. And a lot of those arrests are focusing on minor possession, right? We're not talking about distribution sales or, sales with firearms or any of these kind of more problematic charges. We're talking about a lot of low level drug possession charges. And so some of the myths she wants to address going into this chapter is that the drug laws through the war on drugs focus on kingpins. So this is, if you're interested in learning more about this, there's this great film called The House I Live In that I used to use in this class, but it got slightly outdated. But it's a great film. And it really gets into these kind of myths about the drug laws going after kingpins. So just to give you a basic nutshell of the approach, we'll talk about it throughout this chapter, but Basically, there are provisions in the war on drugs that make it so I can, like, let's say I'm a police officer and I suspect you of a drug crime. I can take your car. I can take the money in your pockets. If I raid your home, I can take your property, right? And it's called civil assets forfeiture, as we'll get to in a minute. And so the whole point of this is to go after kingpins, the Pablo Escobars, the El Chapos, right? You cut off their financial resources because guess what? Fun fact, drug lords don't do it just because of the fame or whatever, the murder. They do it for the money. So if you block the financial resources, guess what? Boom. That kind of goes out. And so that's actually why a lot of people in the US have been arguing for decriminalization of marijuana for many years, right? It's because the cartels in Mexico are estimated about 60% of the revenue, or 60 or more, about 60 to 70% of the revenue is estimated to be from marijuana sales in the US. So the idea being if the US just decriminalized that, right, then people would stop buying from the cartels and they would lose 60 to 70% of the revenue immediately, which would mean then they couldn't pay off cops and judges and hire these mercenary armies to murder people. And you'd see a lot more safety return to Mexico. So anyway, it's interesting when you talk about this kingpin idea, it's a good idea, right, to freeze the assets of kingpins. But the problem is when it's actually just only applied to poor people, shaking them down for 20 bucks in their pocket, it's extremely problematic, right? And they really go into this in that film, The House I Live In, which I do believe you can find on YouTube for free. It's a fascinating documentary that really kind of gets into the impact of the war on drugs. And then the other myth she wants to address right in the beginning is that the drug war is concerned with dangerous criminals. So again, the majority of the people being locked up through the war on drugs are mostly minor, non-violent drug offenses. So we're not talking about murderers or rapists or, people that are, you know, beating their significant others or something like this. And it's interesting too when it comes to the kinds of drugs they're being arrested for, right? In the 1990s, over 80% of all drug arrests were for possession of marijuana. Right nowadays, it's been decriminalized in many states. Some states have it, decriminalized for recreational use. Some other states have it decriminalized for medical use. But the idea is that people are still locked up today from sentences of having, possession and other small, kind of minor, non-violent drug crimes from the 90s. Right? So it's really interesting how these things work. Like the laws can change and decriminalize things, but it doesn't retroactively work to then release all those people from prison who were already locked up for those things. And when we look at who's being policed in what communities, we see that it's disproportionately poor people of color bearing the burden of the war on drugs. So she wants to go right out there and kind of hit those head on and talk about how, the war on drugs should focus on kingpins, but it doesn't. And that the war on drugs is not about dangerous criminals. I mean, the house I live in is a great example of that too. And really, in the film 13th, they go into this as well. The clips that show you the actual quotes from, the Nixon staffer talking about why did they create the war on drugs in the first place? That it was specifically to target African American communities and to target the anti-war left. Right? It was never meant to be something that just actually eradicated drugs, because as you see, it still hasn't. The war on drugs has been going on for over 40 years. Are less people using drugs today? No. Right? So what has it done? Well, it's put a hell of a lot of people in jail, and that's put a lot of revenue into, state, federal, local areas that financially depend on these prisons. And then, of course, whole financial industries have risen up around it, like bail bonds and collect calling industries and, all of these private companies that will manage your fines and fees and restitution payments when you get out of jail, and private prisons, and all of these things that are financially making money off of this human suffering. All right, so getting to the rules of the game. So first she talks about how these things, have changed in the context of the war on drugs, right? So when it comes to police discretion, there are few legal rules that meaningfully restrain the police, at least through the war on drugs. Meaning that in the absence of significant restraints on the exercise of police discretion, so this is problematic because basically it leaves these things to be very interpretable and very, subjective. So that's where prejudice is able to get in pretty easily, when you leave things pretty subjective, right? When you have very clear-cut rules for engagement, it's much better to be able to protect the community through effective policing, but also still have protections of civil liberties, meaning that you're not living in a police state or a military police state where you're being stopped, searched, and detained at all times, or being suspect of a crime all the time when you're doing literally nothing wrong, right? That that's why we have the Fourth Amendment, right? The Fourth Amendment protects against search and seizure without cause. So this means if police want to, let's say, look in your car, right, or your house or your office, they need a warrant, right? And so why is this something in the Constitution at all? Why is it in the Bill of Rights? Well, because police intimidation was very important to the founding fathers, right? Because of the harassment that people in the colonies faced from English soldiers. So it's an interesting part of history. The English soldiers would routinely search, harass, stop, detain, these colonists, which actually was some of the anger that led to the American Revolution, right? This is why it became such a founding principle for our nation. The idea of, freedom from search and seizure. I mean, also the whole not having to not letting soldiers just show up at your house and be like, hey, I live here now, which was also a whole nother part of what happened during the colonies. But anyway, so it's interesting to see like why this was so important to not just our founding, but really a lot of, kind of post-enlightenment societies around the world was this idea of freedom from police repression, right? The police are there to protect you. They're not there to, harass you, right? Or intimidate you. And so this is, a very important principle, but there was a big effect of on the Fourth Amendment because of the war on drugs. So some argue that it has carved, or at least the war on drugs itself has carved a hole into the Fourth Amendment, which gives exceptions for suspicion of drug crimes. And so virtually all constitutionally protected civil liberties are undermined by this change because of the war on drugs, according to Michelle Alexander. Because think about all the things that have changed because of the war on drugs and these exceptions they put into the Fourth Amendment. Meaning, this has brought about all sorts of stuff that we think is normal today that just didn't exist 40 years ago, like mandatory drug testing for employees or students, upholding random searches and sweeps of public schools, right? Permitting police warrants based on anonymous tips, expanding government wiretapping authority, legitimizing the use of paid unidentified informants, which she'll talk about later in the book, is extremely problematic because oftentimes people make things up. They lie. And if their veracity isn't checked before you go and, like, let's say, serve a SWAT team on a location, then, people can get hurt as a result of that, right? And so that's something we'll talk about in a minute, that these unidentified paid informants sometimes are incarcerated themselves. And so therefore they'll say, yeah, I saw so-and-so buying drugs from so-and-so, because they want time off of their sentence, not because that's actually reality. And she outlines a few examples in the book of people who were harmed or even killed in flawed paramilitary raids because of these paid unidentified informants. Also, other things that have been undermined, so other civil liberties. Nowadays, police helicopters can surveil your home without a warrant, right? Like, I lived in Anaheim for many, many a moon, and they have this kind of heat technology that can look through your house and kind of see where you are and what's going on. And they also use it as a way to kind of, monitor drug, people growing marijuana and things of that nature. So it's interesting to see how, like, they don't even need probable cause or a warrant based on neighbors or based on detecting of some kind. It can literally just be you just fly over an entire city and kind of see what you find. It's a fish in a barrel kind of situation, right? Also, this allows people to not just be surveilled without a warrant, but also police are allowed through civil assets forfeiture to take cash from individuals, to take homes, and even, other property. And this is based on unproven allegations of illegal drug activity, meaning it's not like they take your car after you've been found guilty of drug distribution or something like that. It's actually when you're suspected of it. Not when you're charged, not when you're convicted, but when you're suspected. And so this is very problematic, as we'll talk about, because the police actually get to keep a certain amount of the percent of the money that they take during these asset forfeitures, as we'll talk about. So, basically, before all of these changes to the Fourth Amendment, you need a probable cause if you had no warrant. Meaning, like, let's say you hear someone scream, then you're able to enter a house that you haven't been invited into because there's probable cause that a crime might be in place, right? Or let's say you pull someone over, they open their window and you smell alcohol on their breath, right? Probable cause. If you see them kind of swerving across lanes, probable cause to pull them over. Or if they roll down their window and it smells like other drugs, or you see that there's, a gun sitting in the back seat, or anything like that you can kind of see with your eyes, right? Or even hear with your ears, is often the way that you can kind of get around some of those warrant aspects, or at least that used to be the case. But this case, and again, she talks about a lot of court cases because she's a legal scholar. This case of Terry v. Ohio in 1968 modified the way that we understand probable cause to say, quote, if a police officer thinks someone is suspect or dangerous, they're, quote, entitled for the protection of himself and others in the area to conduct a limited search to, quote, discover weapons that might be used against the officer. So this is why if you've ever been stopped by a police officer, they'll go through your pockets and they'll say stuff like, do you have anything sharp that might poke me, that might whatever? Do you have any weapons, blah, blah, blah? Because this is kind of often a pretext to whatever the stop is actually suspected on, right? And so this is kind of where we get those stop and frisk rules from. This gives cops authority to use their discretion without much restraint, meaning you can literally just post up on a street corner and everyone that walks by just be like, hey, you, stop, right? And so that completely goes against the nature of what the Founding Fathers meant by the Fourth Amendment, was that they literally didn't want that to happen, right? Because not only did that cause anxiety, resentment, power struggles, things like that, but think about it, it led to a damned revolution, right? I mean, what do we expect to happen in this country? We keep policing so unequally, right? So it's interesting to see how these, kind of limited changes can actually have profound impacts because of how they get to be very subjectively applied. Also, when it comes to consent searches, cops often phrase stops and searches in a way that can elicit consent, meaning people aren't often very police savvy, so they don't understand in the legal context when they're actually on the record, like what can be held against them and what can't. Meaning, let's say a cop asks you, hey, may I talk to you? If you then talk to them, guess what? You just waived your right to remain silent, right? Even if you were not detained or arrested, you haven't been Mirandized. Just literally consenting to something like, hey, can I talk to you? If you say yeah, then you've literally run right past that part, right? And so this is interesting how this works. If a cop pulls you over and asks to search your vehicle, you can say no, but most people don't realize that, right? Like most people don't feel comfortable saying no. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that if a cop pulls you over, you would be hesitant to say, no, you can't look through my car? Well, I mean, normally we discuss this in class, but, it seems somewhat obvious, right? It's why? Because usually when we talk about it in class, most students say, well, because it makes you look guilty if you say no. And that's, exactly true, right? If you say, no, you can't search my car, there's almost like a assumption that you're hiding something. But in reality, it's this thing called the Constitution. Like they have to have a reason to look through your car, right? So you can say no, right? But most people are not going to say no. And part of this has to do with kind of our sociological understandings of legitimate authority. So Weber came up with this concept of legitimate authority, meaning people that, are given authority by the state are considered a legitimate authority, right? So like you see those lights light up on top of a cop car, right? That means it's not like just some random person pulls you over and is like, hey, you got to do this. You're like, whatever. But when a cop pulls you over, you stop. Well, hopefully you do, because you're not going to get away in the car chase. But anyway, hopefully you pull right over. And that's because they have the authority to actually do that, right? They have the authority to stop you, to detain you for a period of time. So that's given to them by either the city or the state, right? And so as a result, that's why a lot of people obey that particular authority because they regard it as the right thing to do, right? And you have to think about this in kind of the middle class way that we're socialized, right? Little kids are told from a young age, trust the police, obey the police, defer to authority. We learn to defer to authority from the get-go, from our parents, right? And so Weber argues that the reasons that people submit to authority figures, or at least in the case of legitimate authority, is because they have status that's given to them by the state, right? It's not just some rando, it's a guy that has like a uniform and a badge number and like some sort of legitimate authority, right? So they're given the ability to enforce laws. And so that often is a power dynamic difference between two people that can obviously cause, the person with less power to feel like they don't actually have a choice, right? If someone says, "Can I search your car?" Oftentimes you don't feel like you can say no, right? So that's not a choice, really, right? And so a lot of this has to do with just the way that we learn obedience to authority figures from, like I said, the get-go, from our primary socialization of our families, right? So there's two videos I put here. They're on a page on Canvas as well because I can't clip them into this video. Thanks a lot, copyright on YouTube. But anyway, I really want you to take a moment to watch these before we move on to the next part because it's so important to really understanding the point I'm trying to make here, right? So basically, Weber is saying if we think someone has authority over us, we listen to what they say, right? And so I gave two different examples of how this is understood in either sociology or, social psychology. The first being the Asch experiment. So the Asch experiment's an interesting phenomenon. They did this in kind of and you'll see in the video, it's this idea that you're more likely to conform to the group or change what you think is correct to what the group thinks is correct, largely because you don't want to be seen as an outlier or seen as someone who doesn't cooperate. So this comes down to that essential nature of how we as people are a social species, right? We look to each other for definitions and meanings of what's appropriate. So kind of going to the symbolic interactionism as a theory, right? That we define our meanings through interactions with each other. So we look at each other, and so in this case, it's just a line experiment, saying like you match this line to that line. And if everyone says B and you think the answer is A, eventually you're going to say B because you might think, well, if everyone else says B, maybe I'm wrong. And so this kind of falls into how we are socialized into obeying authority in a lot of ways, right? And then the Milgram obedience experiment is kind of like exactly what this is, right? So it's interesting. Well, actually, before I get into Milgram real quick, when it comes to the Asch experiment, it's just the evidence that people will agree to what other people say, right? That we're social creatures and the pressure that's put on us affects us. So in the case of the police and the public, if people feel compelled to go along with what officers say, it's more because they want to go along to get along, to not have, any sort of social breakdown. They want social cohesion. It's not because they actually want or feel comfortable with someone looking through their car for no reason, right? And then the Milgram obedience experiment, this was where, if someone has authority that's perceived over an individual, they're likely to do something that they don't feel comfortable doing, right? Largely because they're trying to appease that person in authority. And really, Milgram was looking at this in the context of the Nuremberg trials and the Nazis. Basically, where, in the Nuremberg trials, when they're trying to sort out all the horrible crimes of the Nazi state, they asked a lot of people in the regime and they said, well, I was just following orders. I was just following orders. When they said, well, how did you kill all these people? How did you do all these horrific things? They said, well, I'm just following orders. And what he was studying, right, Milgram was studying the effect of people basically having a person in authority to shed responsibility onto meant that they could do things that were outside of their, let's say, conscience, right? So if you watch the video, it really gets into this idea that, Milgram had this really interesting idea that you don't ask someone what they do in a hypothetical, you put them in the hypothetical. And of course, no one can redo research like this ever again because it's incredibly ethically problematic. Meaning, in social research, we're never supposed to harm our participants, right? But that's definitely what the Milgram experiment did, and that's why you can't have research like that. You need informed consent so people know that they're, what's going on, because they literally some people thought they killed another person, right? So they're showing extreme stress responses, right? But again, it shows just how much the guy in authority isn't their boss. He isn't like someone that has a lot of power over them. It's just a guy in a lab coat that they think has authority, right? So it's interesting how people will shed responsibilities for horrible things they do if someone in authority tells them to. So this kind of again fits into our understanding of why is it that people don't feel comfortable saying no, get a warrant, right? Or why is it that people often consent to situations where they don't actually feel comfortable doing it? Or, sometimes you have those people that are like, well, I don't need a lawyer because I wasn't guilty, right? And they forget that sometimes the system itself can be wrong, right? And that it's important that each person have an actual day in court, an actual opportunity to defend themselves, you know? So anyway, I want you to just take a moment right now, go to the page on Canvas and watch these videos real quick so you can jump back into my jaw flapping. All right, you just watched the videos. Okay. So, basically, she talks about this idea of how pretext stops are not really about traffic offenses, but the search for drugs. Meaning, there's no evidence that a person broke a drug law, but the minor traffic offense becomes the pretext for the search. So, for example, let's say you do what actually it's even called the California roll because it happens here so much. And I don't mean the yummy sushi, I mean the California roll, meaning through a stop sign, right? Where people stop, but they just kind of like pause for a second. You put your foot on the brake and then you just kind of take it off and roll right through, right? That's often called the California roll, right? Not as delicious, but it's a thing. So if you, let's say you do that, you don't do your full and complete stop, look both ways at your, stop sign. Oftentimes the traffic violation is what gets someone pulled over. Let's say you don't put on your blinker before you change lanes or something like that, a minor traffic violation. People get pulled over and then the police officer will say, all right, may I search your car for drugs, right? Or I need to search your car. And so again, how does, like, when you look at the research, is there a relationship between traffic stops and drug criminality? Absolutely not, right? Some people just don't pause at the stop sign or don't, they run that red light or whatever it might be, but it doesn't actually equate to illegal drug activity. But the idea is that the door has been opened. It's a pretext, right? You can stop this person, and now that they're here, let's see what you can find. And that goes against the nature of how these things are supposed to be enforced, right? It's not supposed to just be a fishing exposition where you just kind of, you know, pick whoever falls into your lap. It's supposed to be based on tracking and, really kind of source tracking the drug networks themselves and trying to take down those drug syndicates, right? So, if you refuse to grant consent, right? If you feel comfortable enough, you watch your obedience experiment and you're like, screw that, they need a warrant. I'm going to say no. Well, then you can be arrested for a minor traffic offense, even if the penalty is only a fine, right? This is a kind of the most high profile version of this would be the Sandra Bland case where, she did an unsafe lane change violation and she was actually arrested instead of given a ticket and let go, largely because she got in an altercation with the police officer. He wanted her to put out her cigarette and she didn't want to. And he forced her out of the car. And then she was, arguing with him basically. So he decided to arrest her. And then what was it, 48 hours, 72 hours later, she was found dead in her cell. She, from a supposed hanging, but her family doesn't think that's what happened. But again, it's still, who knows, right? But the idea is that when it really comes down to it, people started asking, well, why was she in jail at all for a lane change violation? That's not a thing you go to jail for. And it was really, she was in jail for not being, dutiful or basically being disrespectful to a cop, which turns out is not an actual crime. Right? Right? People don't have to be polite to you, right? That's not a thing. As a person who works for the public myself, not teaching, but my other job, um, let me tell you, people are rude as hell, right? But that's just part of it. But in this case, that's what really became controversial about the case is that people were like, well, why was she locked up at all? Because that's not a real thing. But it's because if you at all push back and say no, then there can be consequences, right? And especially the more marginal you are, right? The fact that she was a poor woman of color could affect that, right? Meaning if she was like a very wealthy judge's wife, probably wouldn't have happened, right? And so our status, our identities, our social locations matter when it comes to how we're interpreted by police and, basically how much deference we're given. Meaning you have Jeffrey Epstein, that horrible child sex predator monster who was found guilty of sex trafficking minors, right? Which should be basically a life sentence. He should not get out. And instead, he got to serve like an 18-month sentence where he didn't actually, like, he got to leave jail every day. He just went home, quote unquote, home to jail at night to sleep. But the rest of the day, he would be out at his residence doing God knows what. So it just shows that it's not about the severity of the crime. It's more about the clout, the political, the financial clout of the person itself, right? Because we know that rich people can get great lawyers. They can get all of those kind of opportunities to get away with things. Poor people don't have those resources. And so, police know this, DAs know this, prosecutors know this, and as a result, that's going to affect who they charge and who they don't, right? Another thing that happens too is if you refuse to grant consent, they can bring out a drug sniffing dog. And if that dog indicates in any way, then you're going to be arrested. And so some of those things can be wrong. I mean, obviously these dogs are very well trained, and oftentimes are very essential, especially in situations like airport security and things like that, to find bombs. But the problem is too that they can be wrong as well, right? They are fallible just like anything else, and they can be thrown by other odors that are related to like foods or meats or things like that. So it's not completely, infallible. It's just the idea though that even if you say like, you know what, Fourth Amendment, I don't have to let you in my car, then that can still come with other consequences. So makes sense why most people just go, okay, and just open up and don't often see it as a larger social issue. And especially because this doesn't happen to rich people. This doesn't happen wholesale in rich neighborhoods, right? Where you're not going to have certain cross streets where you're just stopped every single time, or certain areas where you're going to come in contact at least, daily, if not weekly, with law enforcement. So it becomes a part of a person's everyday routine. It's very different than, policing in wealthier areas where when you come in contact with the police, it's because they're trying to protect you or your property, right? So obviously it sets up a very different world for different people depending on what kind of neighborhoods they live in. So when it comes to this approach, she talks about it being kissing frogs, right? That, when you look at drug law enforcement, many innocent people are searched in those consent searches, and they are harassed, they are detained, they are stopped from what they're doing, and it's a very uncomfortable emotional experience, and then they're let go with no apology, no explanation, just like, okay, go, bye. And so that's incredibly humiliating, alienating, etc. And so most people that go through it won't file a complaint, right? Because after you've been harassed by a cop, the last thing most people want to do is go to their job and risk seeing that same person and drawing more attention to themselves. And this is especially true for racial minorities who already fear police abuse and retaliation, meaning people don't expect to get a fair hearing based on how they were violated by police. So the real problem, though, is what they're doing is completely legal. Crazy enough, based on the changed legal understandings of the war on drugs, what they're doing is legal. They're legally able to use pretext to search for something that can then justify the stop, right? Like, let's say you have your parking pass hanging down from your rearview mirror. Boom, pretext. Hey, that's blocking your view, right? Therefore, you get pulled over. Hey, that thing's in the way. Now I'm going to search through your car and look through drugs, which again has no relationship from one to the other. But it becomes, the pretext just means it's an excuse to do that, right? And so a lot of this has to do with, how the DEA have trained police to do these searches throughout the US. So after large doses of funding through the war on drugs, the DEA organized to train local and state agencies on drug enforcement techniques. Basically, these sweeping searches where you pull over everyone, so you end up with a few petty arrests. And a lot of these searches are based on discriminatory criteria for stopping a person. And so one of the most famous programs of this nature is Operation Pipeline in 1984. According to a legal scholar, Operation Pipeline is exactly what the framers of the Constitution meant to prohibit: a federally run general search program that targeted people without cause for suspicion, particularly those belonging to disfavored groups. So again, looking at the poorest, the people that have the least legal and social representation as the most likely criminals, right? Well, we know, guess what? Fun fact. Are drug kingpins poor? No, they're not. Fun fact, they're not. So why are we looking in poor communities for drugs? Why are we not looking in rich communities? Why are we not looking for the people that are buying the judges, the courts, the things themselves, the police themselves, as we see through the corruption in Mexico, right? But the focus tends to be on the people that have the least power. Why? Because it's a hell of a lot harder to put a Pablo Escobar away than it is some guy selling on a street corner. So it becomes what's easiest instead of what's actually best for society and what will actually stop drug crimes. So it's a volume of approach, right? This idea you got to kiss a lot of frogs to find a prince. So the low estimate is at least 10,000 people a year are stopped, with over 95% of those stops being innocent people who have no drugs on them, who haven't committed a crime, who've done nothing wrong, who are just stopped, searched, detained, humiliated for no reason, right? And again, what kind of value system are you going to have of the police if that's part of your daily life? Going to be kind of hard to convince you that they're there to protect you and support you and care about your needs and your rights when they're treating you like a criminal every day, right? So it makes sense that different communities interpret the police differently, as we saw through Code of the Street, largely because of how they interact with them. So the rules themselves are designed to encourage the wholesale roundup of unprecedented numbers of African Americans for minor nonviolent drug offenses. So again, we'll talk about later how this is why she says it connects to, Jim Crow segregation era. So the initial resistance by law enforcement to the war on drugs was actually something that we don't talk about much, but it's interesting to see that initially law enforcement, when the war on drugs was announced, they were like, why? Right? It was met with confusion and resistance by law enforcement because drug use was actually on the decline when the war on drugs started. And it wasn't considered a pressing issue like murder or rape or other, violent crimes that, when you have a criminal that's serially violent, that's incredibly threatening to a community, right? When you have someone that's in possession of marijuana, not necessarily super threatening to a community, right? So shifting of focus, when you see in the 90s, if over 80% of people are arrested for possession of marijuana, then those police are being pulled away from, attention towards other things. And so this is problematic. We'll talk about later how, this is also not just time, but a diversion of resources from more serious crimes. And this is part of the resistance, right? Or at least initially police were resistant to the change through the war on drugs because the shift in focus required a shift in financial resources. So money was being diverted to drug enforcement and away from assault and rape and murder and other more serious crimes. So how did they get the police to agree to be part of this mechanism of this system? Massive increase in budgets, right? So part of the Reagan administration boost for the war on drugs came with massive increases to budgets for law enforcement agencies and proliferation of narcotics task forces. The goal being then, hey, now you're on my side because you're getting the money to do this. And again, still the shift in the focus became, eradicating drug markets and focusing on drug criminals instead of, again, violent crimes. So it's interesting how much these things have changed and how the tools of the system have changed, right? So, for example, SWAT teams. SWAT teams originated in the 60s for hostage situations, hijackings, prison escapes, meaning incredibly rare that you would need a SWAT team, right? How many times you got a hijacking? How many times you got a prison escape? It's not super common, right? But this changed in the 1980s with cash from the federal government. And, of course, thanks to the Gulf War and other military conflicts around the world, access to military equipment, right? And so now SWAT teams are most commonly used to serve drug warrants. So in some jurisdictions, drug warrants are exclusively served via SWAT team. Fun fact, how did people serve drug warrants before SWAT teams? Well, I don't necessarily have wood right here, but you walked up to someone's door, you went, knocked on their door, and said, hey, are you so-and-so? Here's your drug warrant. You have to appear in court. Like, you knocked on a door. That was what that was. Now, what they do is they serve these things called no-knock warrants. Fun fact. So a no-knock warrant, again, talk about TV myths. What do we hear about SWAT teams when we watch TV? They go, "This is the police, open up," or "This is the FBI," right? They're like, boom, 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 knocking on the door, telling people like, "This is who this is, we're coming in," right? Yeah, they don't do that in most cases. In most cases, they serve no-knock warrants, as we'll talk about in a minute, which means they just basically like 2, 3 in the morning, your front door gets knocked down. Someone throws in like a smoke grenade, and you don't know what the hell's happening. And so this causes all sorts of problems, right? I mean, Jesus, the high levels of flawed paramilitary raids between 1989 and 2001 were at least 780 cases of flawed raids took place just from 89 to 2001. So a lot of cases involve people dying in botched raids, right? So some of the examples from the chapter was Alberta Spruill, who was a 57-year-old city worker in Harlem whose apartment complex was raided because an informant who was in prison at the time, even though he said, "Oh, I was buying drugs at this time," he was actually in prison at that time. So if they would have just like double checked what the informant said before they served a SWAT team, that would have helped. So anyway, they didn't, and they sent a SWAT team with a no-knock warrant to her whole apartment complex. So again, we're not talking about one apartment in a complex. That's not something you would see happen in, let's say, Irvine, like South County, or, a wealthy area. If there was a drug criminal that they were going to serve a warrant on, they'd serve it on that particular person, not the entire complex. But that's actually quite routine in a lot of poor neighborhoods, right? So anyway, the SWAT team served a no-knock warrant at her whole apartment complex. They threw flashbang grenades into her apartment, which obviously startled her. She's 57 years old. She had a heart attack and died as a result. And what did the police find in the raid of the entire complex? Nothing. No drugs. And the drug dealer that was supposedly there that they were going to catch was not actually home. Another example from the book is Scott Bryant in Wisconsin in 1995. And they served a warrant on him, a SWAT team, because they found traces of pot in his trash. And so a SWAT team stormed his house and they shot him, Scott Bryant, who was unarmed. His 8-year-old daughter was sleeping in the next room, who actually watched him die before the ambulance showed up. And then another example from the chapter was Stratford High School, where the police raided the school and pulled students into the hallways at gunpoint, terrified them, put them on the floor, searched their lockers, searched all their possessions. Why? Because the principal suspected one student of selling marijuana. So he basically had the entire school raided. Instead of, I don't know, call that one student to your principal's office. And then also, there's this example that I give from Democracy Now! In 2014 where it's really, really sad that they were basically serving a no-knock warrant about 2:33 in the morning. They went to this house. They, basically threw a broken window, threw in a flashbang grenade, which landed in the crib of a 2-year-old sleeping in the living room and exploded, which caused her to obviously have all sorts of, she became deaf immediately. She had all sorts of injuries and was put into a coma and then ended up dying 4 days later. And when they checked into this after the fact, they realized they delivered it to the wrong house, which actually does happen, right? Again, 780 mistakes from just 1989 to 2001. So how many others have we not heard of? How many more have happened since 2001 to 2020, right? Because of this policy, instead of just knocking on the door and being like, "Hey, here it is," right? Instead, busting down people's doors, throwing in grenades into their homes. And what's interesting in that situation I was telling you about with that little girl in 2014, what happened was they said, "Well, we had no way to know that a child was here." And when you look at the front of the house, I mean, there's like a little playpen, there's kids' toys everywhere. I mean, and it wasn't even the right address. Like, how do you bust into someone's house at 3 in the morning and throw grenades in their house and not even have the right address? So again, mistakes can happen. And this is why having such a high charged environment for these things can cause all sorts of, health risks, problems, violence. That's just completely unnecessary. Obviously, SWAT teams are important for their essential functions. Like it says, hostage situations, hijacking, prison escapes, or maybe in a situation where you think that there's like a potentially very violent consequence of something that could happen to you while delivering a drug warrant. But in the overwhelming majority of cases, it's completely unnecessary and overkill, and again, leads to horrible consequences. So part of this has to do with the idea of militarizing the police or transformation from community policing to military policing. So this is instead of making ties with the community where police departments have trained in military style procedures and acquired military style weapons and vehicles, which many find troubling, right? It was when the Ferguson situation happened in 2014 that people saw these armored tanks that are supposed to be for war zones rolling down the streets of a black neighborhood and realized, hey, this is scary. Like, what's going on here? Because technically, there's this thing called, there was this thing called the Posse Comitatus, I don't know, whatever, sorry, Act, said it wrong, which was passed in the Civil War era. But basically, it prohibited the use of military for civilian policing, trying to keep very separate the military that's supposed to protect the country from the police that are supposed to, enforce and protect the communities. Because once you have military rule like that, there's a lot of, dictatorships and authoritarian countries that have that. And so it was very important to kind of put a gap between the two to make sure that, the weapons of war are not found in our streets, right? And so, but this military cooperation with law enforcement act that happened, in the early 2000s, carved a huge exception into that, previous Civil War era law that prohibited the use of the military for civilian policing. And so as a result, you've seen, all sorts of military style weapons, military, armored vehicles, all these kind of things showing up in small communities. And as a result, as these videos I want to show you actually, again, the links for this will be on the page on Canvas. I want you to, kind of take a moment and sit down and look at these because these really get into how this transformation has happened. The first video talks about how the transformation has a financial incentive, meaning capitalism loves those financial incentives. So if there's a way to make money off of arming the police, then that's something that's going to be celebrated and promoted, right? So, there's a lot of funding through, basically post 9/11 that now goes straight to law enforcement agencies to buy all this equipment, right? And then the other video talks about how, basically the situations within Ferguson that kind of led to some of these problems, meaning it wasn't just about one person being killed by the police, and that's not why people were protesting. It was more so because it was almost like the straw breaking the back kind of situation where it was just happening so much and to so many people, and so many people could see their own situation in that killing that, you know, um, again, financially, the city was actually making a large part of its revenue off of fines and fees levied predominantly on Black communities. So even the city itself profits from that kind of inequality. So it's interesting how this is extremely problematic, as we'll talk about through this book, because guess what? Community policing is what makes policing most effective for the community and for the police. Because think about it. If you're a police officer, let's say you're trying to solve a murder, right? You're in a community that has gang murders, right? And you're trying to solve a murder. And what if you go to the neighbors and they slam the door in your face, right? They don't want to cooperate with you. They don't feel comfortable with you, right? They feel like you're going to target them. Then guess what? You're going to have a hell of a time trying to actually solve a case, right? But community policing is when people are integrated within the community themselves. They understand the policymakers in the community. They understand, the regulars, the people who live there, the long time, the kind of old timers that are there, and they're able to work with them, right? So work with the local schools and churches and community centers and things of that nature that have that connection back to the community. And oftentimes in community policing, the police themselves live in that same community. So they actually are going to have much more investment in what happens in the community, right? Like let's say you're wealthy and you're living 30 miles outside of the area you're policing, you're not really going to care as much about the situations that are going on in that community that don't necessarily affect where your children go to school, where your children play, those kind of things. In the same way as if you're living in that same community, you're going to be very, consequential about making sure it's as safe as possible because it's also yours. So it's interesting. Community policing is a very valuable tool because it makes it better for police because they have community partners and cooperation, and they are able to, have people help them solve the things that they need to solve. Well, on the other hand, having community policing is incredibly better for the community because then they feel comfortable calling the police. Then they actually will cooperate in investigations and things like that because they don't feel targeted. They don't feel unjustly treated. So we need to get back to community policing because that's what has been the most effective in America. But unfortunately, in recent decades, we've moved farther and farther towards military style policing, where it's a very kind of power dynamic, us and them, unequal situation, which does not have, that same kind of investment in community, that connection situation. If you're that same cop working that beat for 10 years and you know everybody in every shop and you know the people that live in those communities, you're going to have a much better experience as an officer, and really just as a way you're going to have more resources to use to figure out what's going on the street, right? But if you're coming in with, in a tank with a, an automatic weapon, guess what? That's going to scare the shit out of people. And they're not going to feel as comfortable being open with you about what's going on in the community, right? And especially if they're being targeted and stopped and searched and dehumanized every day, they're not going to feel too warm and fuzzy about the situation, right? So it's a win-win for everyone to get back to community policing. And we'll talk about that throughout this book. So just take a second now and watch these two videos just so that you can kind of get a sense of what I was talking about here. Alrighty, moving on to finders keepers. So when it comes to how this kind of works out, state and local law enforcement agencies are actually granted portions of the assets they seize when waging the drug war. So the emergence of drug forfeiture laws came about in the 1970s. And again, the ideology behind it was to seize the property and assets of a drug dealer to get at the economic root of drug crime. But in 1984, Congress amended the federal law. And this is when things got a little crazy, right? So they allowed federal law enforcement agencies to retain and use any and all profits from asset forfeiture. And they allowed state and local agencies to retain up to 80% of the asset's values. So suddenly, a police department could increase their own budget. They could just take cash. They could take someone's car. They could take someone's home. If they're suspected of drug use or sales, they can just take your stuff and guess what? Boom, revenue problem solved. Right? So that's extremely problematic. Again, the film The House I Live In, there's a scene where they're, talking to this officer that kind of posts up on the border. There's like one road coming in from Mexico, and he just basically stops every single person that goes by, regardless of any, criminal infraction. And, that kissing a lot of frog situation. And he did actually make a bust at some point that was enough with the civil assets forfeiture to buy himself a new cruiser. So the car they're sitting in when they're talking about it, he bought from the money that he seized from one of those stops. So again, it kind of almost reinforces itself in a loop. Like if you're an officer, you're going to focus on those particular crimes. Why? Easy to solve. Revenue comes in, right? And if you're targeting poor communities, they're not going to have lawyers. They're not going to be able to get past those kind of convictions, right? It's going to make you look like, hey, look how many cases I have solved, how many dockets are cleared, right? And so this is problematic because it gives the police an incentive, not just to only look for drugs, but also an incentive to lie about finding drugs, because then you can just take someone's car, take someone's house, and have revenue. So probable cause could be based on nothing more than hearsay, innuendo, or paid, self-serving testimony of anonymous informants, which is insane, right? Meaning you're getting paid for it. You're also probably getting time off your sentence. And just taking your word for it without actually investigating it first is incredibly bad, right? So very little evidence is needed for raids and searches based on this information. But once a property is seized, the burden is on the person to prove the innocence of the property. It's supposed to be innocent before we're proven guilty, but when it comes to these forfeiture laws, it changes that dynamic. So drug forfeiture laws undermine the original intent to go after kingpins because the poor are unable to sue to get their property back, but the rich, those kingpins, are able to get, counsel, so they have a lawyer or someone to work on their behalf. They're able to some extent circumvent the system and avoid the forfeiture, which might slow down their economic progress as big time drug dealers, but doesn't actually stop them, unfortunately. But taking, the $100 out of someone's pocket, that's a poor person, that's all they have, that stops them, but it doesn't actually stop drug crime. Because think about it. If you just take people at the lowest end, like let's say people selling small amounts of drugs, right? The low level dealers. If you arrest a low level dealer, does that stop like another person from taking his place? Absolutely not. But if you stop a kingpin, that definitely shakes up the distribution network so much that might actually fall apart, right? And that's kind of the whole goal of these programs, is to actually stop them, not just to only focus on the people that have the least power and just keep poking them over and over, trying to hopefully find some drugs to justify those searches. But again, if 90+% of people who were stopped and searched and detained have nothing on them, right? Then you got to stop and search and detain a lot of people in order to justify this model. So the need to maintain funding also means high arrest rates, right? Because departments are now used to that federal funding. So they have to maintain a high arrest rate to meet the standards to renew those funds. So this also applies to those other federal grants. So this is when, people say, oh, there's a quota system, and then cops say, no, there's not a quota system. Well, there's a sort of quota system that results, meaning that officers are going to feel compelled to keep their numbers up, especially if they want to be promoted or retained, or, again, if they want to retain the kind of federal funding that they're getting already, right? So there's an example for the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department where employees reported that deputies were routinely planting drugs and falsifying reports to establish probable cause so they could get these cash seizures and then use the cash themselves. Right? So this isn't so far away. It's a pretty local example. I mean, the Rampart Division was kind of known for this corruption, planting guns, planting drugs, all of these horrible, egregious situations of police brutality, um, some of which were actual sexual assaults. I mean, just horrifying stuff coming out of the Rampart Division that, was really kind of prominently happening during a lot of the time period she's focusing on here, especially like the 1990s. So, another example that was given was these particular rich folks and civil assets forfeiture reform. So, there was Donald Scott, William Munnerlyn, and basically what happened was these people were caught up in that same civil assets forfeiture loop, but they were rich. So, as a result of them getting kind of screwed through the system, laws actually change. So again, this shows how power makes an impact. Because if you screw over a rich person, the law might actually change, right? But if you're just focusing on targeting the least powerful people, nothing changes. So what's interesting about this is it did change a bit, but again, it doesn't address the central issue, which we'll talk about in a second. So some of the egregious cases this is based on, let me go through those really quick. So this is what kind of led to calls for reform. First was Donald Scott, who owned a Malibu ranch, right? And so it was alleged that he was growing marijuana. So they raided his Malibu ranch um, in a SWAT raid. They turns out he wasn't growing anything. And that it was a pretext later revealed that they just wanted to seize his assets because it was worth a bunch of money. So think of it this way. You stop someone in a crappy, car, you take their car, you get X amount of money. You get a Malibu ranch. Do you know how much the money that's worth? That's worth a hell of a lot of money. So actually the way that they found that out too, I believe, was through um, internal memos and internal communications like emails from officers to each other, right? About this pretext of, okay, we're gonna pretend that we heard that he was selling marijuana so we can take his property. So obviously you don't want a situation that allows for misconduct to happen, right? And another example was William Munnerlyn, who the cops took his Learjet because basically he was suspected of a drug crime. He was actually charged with, I think it was a possession of like cocaine or one of those. Um, and they dropped the charges within 72 hours, right? But he had to fight a legal battle for 5 years to get his jet back, right? So he paid 5 years legal fees. He finally got his jet back with $10,000 worth of damage to it. Not that I'm like, oh no, his poor jet. I mean, obviously, but it's still like that's one of the richest people with all the resources. Like, if you own your own private jet, you're doing pretty well. So if you can afford 5 years legal fees, 5 years of that, get a $10,000 worth of damage to your Learjet, like obviously people start kind of taking notice of like, hey, that's not fair. You're like, yeah, it's not. But it's also not fair when it happens to poor people, right? When they take the little money or the car, the little amount of things that someone has, right? So the legislation for Civil Forfeiture Reform Act focus on those kinds of cases, those big cases, right? The ones where, a Malibu ranch is getting swept up, not focusing on, really just ignoring the proliferation of cases where poor people were routinely targeted. So this is why she says that the reform itself does not address the central issue, which she sees as the profit motive for police, meaning the basic structure remains intact, right? Because think of it this way, if you got rid of the profit motive, she thinks you get rid of a lot of the corruption, because let's say police can seize your assets, but they don't get to keep any of it. Then there's no motivation to lie. There's no motivation like the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department was doing to plant drugs, right? There's no motivation to manipulate that for your own financial gain, right? So it just makes sense. Like, if you don't change the mechanism of that, then the problem of it still remains. Another huge issue when it comes to the myths is legal representation. So how does the design of the system help ensure the creation of a massive undercast? Well, most Americans don't realize many people never have access to legal representation at all. Or, really, how many innocent people plead guilty to a lesser crime or take a plea bargain in order to avoid the possibility of getting long sentences from mandatory minimums. And so this is, another horrible fact is that 80% of criminal defendants can't afford a lawyer. And the, public defender program is woefully ineffective. So public defenders have very little time to spend on their cases and far more cases than their workload can handle. And as a result, many have over 100 cases that are open at once, meaning they can't offer meaningful protections to defendants, let alone vet the facts of their cases. And so this results in many plea bargains and many wrongful convictions. Because think about it. There might be a witness that can say, hey, no, I saw so-and-so. They were at the library with me when that happened. Okay, well, bring that person in and interview them. Well, if this person only has 10 minutes to meet with you before your trial starts that day, guess what? They don't have the time to find that person, to vet that person, to go through any of that work that if you had a private attorney and you were paying them, they could 100% do that, right? So this just means that rich people, even if they're guilty, have better representation than poor people if they're innocent, right? And so that's incredibly problematic. Down here at the bottom, I put some figures from research that Mother Jones was talking about here from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, talking about how many cases are recommended for, different kinds of cases. So you see misdemeanors, felonies, and juvenile cases. The red is the actual cases, the kind of orangey red, and the, kind of, green blue there is how many cases are actually recommended. So you can see that they're given way more cases than they can actually handle. And then when you look at this other chart over here, this one is about how much time they should be spending on each case, depending on the type of case it is. And you actually see the average time that they're spending is far lower than what's actually needed. And so what this means is that it's not that public defenders are bad people or public pretenders, right? That they're bad people. It's just largely that they don't have the time and ability to do that much work. Like, if you've taken 4 classes at once, right? Or if you're insane and have done that 5th class situation, that's incredibly hard, right? But taking over 100 court cases at the same time is like taking 20 classes a semester. Like, it's just almost impossible. Like, it's like there's no way you're going to get an A and maintain your GPA and all of that, because there's no way you have enough time and energy to focus on all of them to give them the amount that they should have. And so the problem with this public defender program, the reason it's so ineffective is because we don't give enough money to it. We give so much money so that the cops can like buy tanks, but we don't give any money to the legal system so that, states and, local areas can have enough money for public defenders, right? There should be at least 10 times as many public defenders as there are right now, right? And so this is incredibly problematic. And not to mention that some states don't offer representation pretty much at all, right? So Wisconsin's the example she gives in the book that many states have financial expectations that defendants have to pay a lawyer, right? So meaning even if you make a very little amount of money, that disqualifies you for a public defender, right? So the Wisconsin example is you can't have a public defender if you make over $3,000 a year. $3,000 a year is like having a summer job. It's nothing, right? Plus, it's going to cost you at least $3,000 just for a retainer for that attorney. It's kind of insane to think that you would, let me just save up my $3,000 from the entire year of working so I can pay to have this lawyer for like a week, right? It doesn't make any damn sense, but this is the case. And as we'll talk about later, oftentimes the people that don't have representation at all are, children, especially immigrant children in our kind of crim-migration system we have now. So moving on for more legal representation. Sometimes proceedings take place without realizing a defendant is mentally ill or does not adequately understand English, which is horrifying, but again, showing just how little time there is to prepare on behalf of actually defending that client. Another huge issues are debtors' prisons. These are something that are supposed to be illegal in this country, but some argue that it's still taking place in poor communities because for those residents, the fines and fees from their arrests go to support local agencies, right? And so financially, this is again put mostly on people that are poor. So this video I have here, again, I'm going to put this up on that page for you. So I want you to take a moment here once I'm done jaw flapping for a sec to watch that video. I just want you to pay attention when you're watching the video too. What is the crime that the sister has been charged with? Because it's insane. Like, what is the context of the crime she was charged with? Right? Spoiler, it has to do with her car. But just what was the situation going on there? Right? And so when you hear the context of how do you get a ticket for something like that when you're not even doing the thing that you're supposedly being cited for? Like, how can you be cited for driving when you're sitting in a parked car? Right? In your own yard. In your own backyard. Anyway, so you'll see that in the video. But the reason I put that there is to show that there's a financial incentive to this inequality, right? That like the town of Ferguson that kind of blew up and all this racial resentment in 2014 and 2015 with those protests was largely a result of the fact that people there were being unfairly, levied upon, that a lot of the revenue coming from their stops and searches and seizures are really just going right back to fund the town. So the town becomes reliant upon that harassment for their own financial gain. And so again, the charges that people are being put in prison for, they're not being put in prison because they committed another crime. They're being put in prison because they didn't pay the fines and fees from the last time they were in prison. And so again, we're supposed to not have debtors' prisons in this country. It's supposed to be illegal that you shouldn't go to jail just because you're poor. They're supposed to work out a reasonable payment schedule with you to get you to somehow be able to pay off what you need to pay off. But you're not supposed to go to jail for it. But unfortunately, this is incredibly common. And as I'll have another video for you later talking about how the situations that happen in these poor inner city neighborhoods are actually a reflection of what happens in poor rural areas just to poor whites instead of poor people of color. So moving on. Okay, again, just please take the moment right here to actually watch that video. All right, you watched it. Anyway, okay, so the fundamental right to a lawyer is assumed to be the right, but it's not the reality across the U.S., as we talked about with the Wisconsin example. And so this is problematic because a lot of people, they see the outcomes of the criminal justice system, right? They see that, this person was convicted of a particular crime. Therefore, they must be guilty because they got their day in court, right? The law is blind and impartial. But the problem is that, again, if you don't actually have a lawyer to represent you, then there's no way to make sure that you actually got a fair trial. And children caught up in the system are the most vulnerable. They're the most likely to not have legal representation. So you're talking about they're already vulnerable because they don't understand the laws as well as adults. They're not going to be able to navigate those systems very well, but then also to not have legal representation is extremely problematic. And we'll talk more about juvenile justice system later on and just all the kind of, school to prison pipeline and funneling of certain communities into prisons while other communities, they can act up as kids a lot, and it's kind of just seen as boys will be boys or kids will be kids. It's just, seen as a youthful transgression. So nearly all cases are resolved through plea bargaining these days. So rarely does a case ever make it to a courtroom. So it's the opposite of our Law and Order shows that we watch. It's really just law. No, it just means that, that show's a lot shorter in our real system because it's plea bargains, right? The overwhelming majority of charges are settled through plea agreements. So why would a prosecutor want to solve things through plea bargains? Because it's actually considered a win, right? Like, let's say you're a prosecutor and you go to court. It's like if you're an athlete, then you have stats that you're rated on, right? Like if you're, how many at bats or how many free throws or whatever, that all those kind of stats, all that fun nerdy stats stuff with sports, right? Prosecutors have the same thing, right? If they go into court, they have their wins and their losses. How many times have they won a case? How many times have they lost? And that has a lot to do with if they're promoted, if they become DA, right? Their prominence and their pay is often linked to their convictions. So why are nearly all cases resolved through plea bargains? Because that's considered a win for the prosecutor. It's counted as a win. Just to basically force a person to agree to something, it's counted as a win. And largely this happens through overloading, as we'll talk about in a second. So anyway, the prosecutor themselves, as I should get to here, are also the most powerful law enforcement official in the criminal justice system. This is what she's arguing in the book, that they can charge or dismiss charges without justification or oversight. Right? So that Jeffrey Epstein thing again. Right? There was plenty of times when he came in contact with the criminal justice system where he had charges just dismissed. Egregious sex trafficking stuff of children dismissed. Why? Because he was very wealthy, very powerful, had friends, including a former president and the current president, right? So, well, and, a prince and all these other garbage people. So what's interesting about that is that the prosecutor themselves can then just decide, okay, well, I think this person should be charged or I think this person shouldn't be charged. And why is that problematic? Well, obviously, if they're using kind of their legal knowledge, it's not, right? If they're trying to counter their bias. But if they're just doing it based on, this person seems worthy to me and this person doesn't, that's obviously mitigated by prejudice, right? By bias, by stereotyping, and so that's where the kind of racism and classism and other isms sneak in to this process. As we saw with the Ahmaud Arbery case, right? The prosecutor deciding not to charge the father and son with any crime, even though they're literally videotaped on tape murdering a person, right? And that the police had that for months. But then when you find out, the prosecutor was friends with the murderer because he used to be a cop, that's when you see how problematic it is that there's no oversight, right? It's not that we can't trust every prosecutor or anything like that. It's not that like every prosecutor is a bad person. It's just that sometimes their bias or their own, prejudice can affect justice. And that's not what is supposed to happen, right? This gives them a ton of power over who goes to prison and who doesn't. And that's incredibly, incredibly problematic. So overloading is another impact of how people get forced into plea bargains. So overloading is when you can file more charges against someone than you can prove against a defendant in court. So this is an incredibly common practice called overloading. Basically, prosecutors admit that they routinely charge people with serious crimes for which they technically have probable cause, but no hope of winning in court. Right? So they load up a defendant with charges that carry extremely harsh sentences in order to force them to plead guilty to lesser offenses. And so this also obtains testimony for other cases, meaning it encourages snitching, a super unreliable form of information, in order to, kind of solve other cases, right? So basically, let's say you get pulled over, you get a pretext stop, you rolled through a stop sign, and they find drugs in your car, right? But then they also find in your trunk you had, I don't know, plastic bags, right? Or you're like really into baking and you bought some supplies. So you have some plastic bags, you have like a scale that you're going to measure your baking ingredients on or something like that. They find that in your trunk, and even though it has no drug residue or connection to the situation, they say, hey, guess what? You had bags and a scale, so we're going to charge you with distribution, which is a 15-year mandatory minimum sentence. So then you, as a poor person that has very bad legal representation, has to choose, do I go against this up in court, right? Or do I take the plea bargain and leave? And as, you'll see in the film 13th, the Khalif Browder situation where he was at Rikers Island and he was charged, basically was never formally charged. He was suspected of stealing a backpack, and he spent years at Rikers undergoing beatings by fellow, inmates, by guards, having a horrible mental health crisis as a result. All because, as they say in 13th, he had the audacity to say, no, I'm not guilty, and I'm not going to say I'm guilty to something if I'm not guilty, right? And that's what people tend to think. They think, well, no one's going to plead guilty to something they're not guilty of. But people do it every damn day. Why? They want to get back to their families. They don't have faith that the system will be fair and actually find justice, because there's so many examples where they haven't found it, right? Or so many ongoing cases where, this is still a problem. So that's incredibly problematic, right? And we want a system that actually functions effectively, that we can have faith in. So an unprecedented number of innocent people are now pleading guilty, not because they're guilty, but because they're trying to avoid the possibility of harsh mandatory minimum sentences. And again, mandatory minimums also encourage that snitching again. Why? So you get a shorter sentence. So defendants have to basically, either come up with stories out of whole cloth or just, kind of embellish a bit in order to try to get their own things thrown down. And again, you do see this in the cop shows, right? Where they're like, well, we can charge you with this mandatory minimum, or you can work with us and we'll tell the DA you worked with us, kind of thing. It just shows it's a pressure point that's put upon people to kind of force the outcome that the system wants. But that's not justice. So, the amount of innocent people in prison is another consequence, meaning we know that if people don't have a lot of representation, and if they have labels and stigma against them, they might take a plea deal in order to rejoin their family and not, lose their home, lose their jobs, lose their life, really, in that system. And so DNA has shown this, right? I mean, in the last 20 years, we've seen a lot of people have been exonerated because DNA showed they didn't commit the crime that they were locked up for many years, right? So clearly the system has flaws and we want to improve it. We want to learn from the past and find ways to make it a more equitable system, right? Find ways to make sure that, yes, if a person is a danger to society and they are going to harm people, that they are incarcerated, but that those people who have made a mistake, who could otherwise go to a drug treatment program, who otherwise, may just have addiction or mental health issues, that they can get the help that they need to get them to a better place, which would actually help support communities, right? Instead of tearing them apart. So once you're locked up for a drug charge, the chances of being released are very slim. So the institution has the power to label you, and that label often sticks. So like we'll talk about with labeling theory, right? Even those who had a letter from a judge with an exoneration are still much less likely to get a job than a person who has not been labeled by the criminal justice system. And so mandatory minimum sentences destroy judges' discretion. So just like, again, in that film, The House I Live In, highly recommend it, they interview judges that talk about how they're not able to use the context of a person's situation in order to, kind of weigh in on how long they should be in prison, which is the whole point of a judge. A judge looks at the case, says, okay, this person is guilty of this particular crime, but let's say it's stealing, right? What's the context? Is this person stealing, a pair of sunglasses that are designer sunglasses so they can look cool? Or is this person stealing formula for their baby because their baby's hungry and they have no money, right? The context matters, and it should matter, right? As we talked about, it's an essential part of our criminal justice system. And so that's why judges are supposed to have discretion, right? But mandatory minimums destroy judges' discretion. So judges hate it because they don't get to weigh in. So one of the examples in The House I Live In, the judge talks about how, like, he's doing disservice to the man that they're showing in the clip because he basically has to give him 20 years in prison, even though the violation that he's being pulled in for should not really warrant that, especially dealing with the context of his crime and really his background, just having no resources, no opportunities, and how that should be taken into context. But unfortunately, the mandatory minimum sentences say, okay, like let's say you get caught with this particular drug and a gun, 15 years, 15 to life, 25 to life for some of these things, where judges can't say, well, this is an extraordinary circumstance because of X, Y, or Z, and give a different sentence, right? So the judges themselves become kind of arbitrary in that system. There's also a court case she talked about that tried to challenge this, and it failed in court. So the legal mandatory minimum sentences remain since the 80s. And mandatory minimum sentences are justified as keeping criminals off the street, but they're most often used in nonviolent drug offenses. As we talked about, those are not the people that you're worried about, committing all of those violent crimes. So instead of, using drug treatment or other rehabilitation programs that are more effective and save taxpayers, millions of dollars, and of course better for communities, instead we focus on incarceration. And we talked about this before, California's three strikes laws. So our laws, as we discussed, had different criteria where your third strike was any crime that made you eligible for life in prison or 25 to life. So instead, in California, your third violent felony was basically the way that it was done federally. Like you had to have violent felonies. But California, it was literally like any crime. So that exploded the prison population in California. And later, there was a proposition that we had to pass just to make people serve 2/3 time because overcrowding is such an issue in California prisons still to this day. So we can see how legislation, laws, these changes can cause huge ripple effects throughout the system. So the prison label itself is very important to understand. This kind of comes through this concept of labeling theory, the power to label, you know, basically who gets to label who, and how the label itself then affects your perceptions of yourself and the way other people look at you. So it comes down to deviance, right? The idea of, who's considered problematic, who's considered criminal. And in our society, we have a lot of stereotypes and prejudices that affect who we think is criminal or who we assume to be as criminal. And a lot of this has to do with the power dynamics in the structures of our society. So once you're labeled a felon, you enter a parallel world of discrimination, stigma, and exclusion that are all legal, right? And so this is her argument that, mass incarceration is like a new Jim Crow, right? So whether or not someone went to prison for their felony status, it creates second-class citizenship, right? Meaning that basically you were legally excluded from a bunch of things, which we'll talk about through the cruel hand, right? That there's 5 specific things that you're being limited from that then affect your opportunities to actually get out of the cycle, right? So, people on probation and parole are often not seen as part of the system, right? They're just kind of seen as, people that, that have somehow exited the system. But there's more people under correctional control today when it comes to in prison, on parole, or probation than there were enslaved in the last decade before the Civil War, in slavery, right? So obviously, when we look at these situations, we have to see that there's definitely a huge prejudicial problem happening here that has a structural issue. So, Louis Quant, a scholar on race, that talks about this as a closed circuit of perpetual marginality, just meaning that, so if you kind of combine what we talked about through Code of the Street to this situation in a new Jim Crow, right? You're born into an impoverished neighborhood. You don't have financial opportunities because you're poor. You face racial prejudice because you're a person of color. So you have limited legitimate opportunities. You grow up in a situation where a counterculture is more powerful than the dominant culture, right? Where the people that have the most status and power are the people who are the most violent, the people who sell drugs, the people that are in the underground economy or doing illicit, drug sales. And so how does that then set up your socialization differently, right? When you feel like you have no hope for the future, you're not going to go to college, you're not going to have a good career. There's no point in trying to have legitimate success. So what do? You go for bad, right? As we talked about through Code of the Street. You get pulled into the street culture. You see the financial incentive, or as we saw, in Crips and Bloods, right? That a lot of these men just felt like they didn't have real resources for community, that there weren't other ways to protect themselves, and that without, good police presence in a kind of community aspect instead of a more, prejudicial aspect, you don't feel like the gang ends up running the neighborhood instead of, the police. And so it becomes a very problematic situation where people feel like they have to join gangs in order to be safe, right? And so it's this closed circuit of perpetual marginality because, okay, so you join that gang, you get caught up in a drug, raid or any other, maybe just a pretext stop or a stop and search situation. You are found with drugs, you go to jail. Then what happens? When you get out of jail, you have even less resources. Now you owe hundreds, if not thousands of dollars in restitution and fines and fees and all these other court costs, right? So now you have less money, you have less opportunity to get a job because now you have a felony status, right? You can't get financial aid at colleges, you can't get food stamps, you can't get any of these things that would help lift you out of that poverty. So what does it do? It almost kind of forces you right back into whatever criminal enterprise or track that you might have been involved with, whether it was just, your addiction and drug use, or if it was actually like being a part of a gang or any other, underground economy facet where if that's, if you get out of jail and you have that felony and you have to check that on the employment application, the underground economy doesn't care. The underground economy isn't going to say, give me 3 references and your GPA and your transcripts and, you know, show me all the places you've worked before. You're not going to have to go through all those hurdles in the same way. So if you're already locked out of opportunities, it just gets worse and worse. Then you end up going back to jail again, right? We see this with recidivism, the fact that a large percentage of the people that go to jail end up back in jail within 2 to 3 years of being released. Why is that? Well, Louis Laquant says it's because we have this closed circuit of perpetual marginality. You become more marginal when you get out of jail. So you're more likely to end up back in jail. And then what happens when you get out of jail that time? You're even more likely to end up back in jail. That the more you get caught up in the system, and some of these people, remember, are getting caught up in the system in their teen years. Once you're in that system, it's incredibly hard to get out, right? So it just becomes a circle of having less and less opportunity, less and less resources, which almost pushes people down a path of more deviance. So how do we stop that cycle? Well, lessening sentences would help alleviate some suffering, but it's not going to fix the full problem. And removing mandatory minimum sentences would help because then judges could have discretion again, and then people won't be going 25 to life for, smaller crimes. But again, that's still not going to fix the problem. So unless the numbers of people labeled as felons are dramatically reduced, and unless the laws and policies that keep ex-offenders marginalized from the mainstream society and economy are eliminated, the system will continue to create and maintain an enormous undercast. So this is why we have to really look at these things from a kind of sociological structural way to see what's wrong with the system, how's it not working? So how can we change this, stop this cycle, and give an opportunity for a much more equitable, just criminal justice system?